is for critical thinkers. And now, here's your host, integrated media professor, longtime Spokane Talk radio personality, and award-winning broadcast veteran, Mike Fitzsimmons.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to this edition of For Critical Thinkers. We're just a few days from the most important election, certainly in my lifetime, perhaps in the last 100 years or more. And we're going to talk about not only the issues, but some of the things that perhaps are important for us to know and to do before we cast a ballot. Just a little bit of a preamble for what we're going to talk about. As of 3:30 this afternoon Eastern Time, Thursday, November the 29th, 2020, early voting data shows that a total of 80,721,558 Americans have voted in the election of 2020 so far. That number includes 52,400,052 mail-in ballots and another 28,321,806 in-person balloting. And note that some states don't differentiate between mail ballots and in-person ballot voters, so we may not have those statistics exactly right, but the total we do, 80 million plus, almost 81 million. Now, how many of those voters this year have, or how many will, engage in critical thinking before casting a ballot? Forecasts are suggesting that totally we could have 150 million voters cast ballots before the polls close at the end of voting day next Tuesday. At that level, it would dwarf the 139 million people who voted in the 2016 election, and it would be the largest per capita percentage for voting in more than a century, dating clear back to 1908. So this is going to be a big election with an awful lot of participation. Let us remind you of what critical thinking is before we go through this. And I would hope that you'd keep this in the back of your mind so that this is what you see we're applying to some of the things that we are talking about. Critical thinking simply is, and I've mentioned this in the past on this program, the objective analysis and evaluation of an issue in order to form a judgment. That's what critical thinking is. And in order to think critically, it involves such things as vetting, thorough examination, verification. In other words, we've got to put a lot of thought into it if we're going to be critical thinkers. It's not just a knee-jerk reaction. Now, there's a long-standing understanding among anthropologists, psychologists, social scientists, that we all act in our own best interest. That anybody, a person will, a normal person of a sound mind, will act in his or her own best interest. And what constitutes our best interest? How do we know what our best interests are? Well, obviously, it's a function of several things. Our upbringing, the way we were trained, the way we were taught, the way our parents showed us how to deal with issues, life, and problems in life, and adversity, and that sort of thing. Our own life experiences, which have taught us a great many things. Primarily, that would be, if you will, the equivalent of the school of hard knocks. And also education, formal education, that which we have learned as students, not only in school, but also since we left school. And all of these things have helped us to form our values, our worldview, and our perspectives. But really, when we act in our perceived best interests. In other words, sometimes we can be duped. Well, we've all made a bad investment, or all trusted somebody we shouldn't have, or bought that car that turned out to be a lemon, or whatever the case happens to be. So it's our perceived best interests, if you will. And hopefully our perception of our best interest and our best interests will be the same thing. And so when we vote, these things are also on our mind, or they should be. And the problem is that very often they are not. Back in 1980, remember this? Back in 1980, when he was running for president for the first time, Ronald Reagan asked, "Are you better off now than you were 4 years ago?" Remember when that was asked? And by the way, that has been a standard that ever since that question was first asked by President Reagan, by Governor Reagan at the time that he was running for president. This has been asked year after year after year during a national election. Are you better off now than you were 4 years ago? Now, a recent Gallup poll that was released just earlier this month says that 56% of Americans say that they are better off now than they were 4 years ago. And mind you, that statement also takes into account the problems that we have seen with COVID-19. So, and by the way, what constitutes better off now than 4 years ago may be economic. We generally sort of default to that position and come to the conclusion that it's really an economic statement we're making, but it's not all that. Comfort zone on a variety of other things, not necessarily related to economics, are part of whether or not we feel as though we're better off. But 58% said they are better off now. Only 32% said in the survey by Gallup that they were worse off. Now that, by the way, that 56% happens to be the highest since this survey began. Give you an example of some of the other surveys in past years. The 1984 survey was a 44% statement that they were better off. In 1992, only a 38% statement that they were better off. 2004, it was 47%. And in 2012, it was 45%. Now, ask yourself, are you better off now than you were 4 years ago? And if the answer is yes, obviously, then you have a criteria to apply to that. That can't just be a gut reaction. There's got to be a criteria associated with that, right? And sometimes there is, but very often it's just a feeling. Very often people will say, no, I'm not, or yes, I am, very definitely. And they may be thinking of a variety of different reasons as to why they're better off. This is the same sort of thing that happens when they're asked the question, is the country going in the right direction or the wrong direction? Of course, the criteria for what would constitute the right direction or the wrong direction is basically up to the respondent. What you think the right direction is may not even be at all what I think the right direction is, and both of us might say, oh yeah, we're going in the right direction, but we may not apply the same criteria. The average American voter is not very curious, as you probably know, and is shamefully uninformed. In fact, I've said this on this program and many other times during my history as a talk host on radio in these parts, that the biggest single threat to America's security and future is the profound ignorance of the American people. The fact that they just don't know very much and don't seem to care that they don't know very much, and therefore don't seem to be motivated to learn very much. That always has troubled me. And since that's the case, and we're going into a major election with tremendous consequences hanging in the balance, one has to ask the question, how do we know we're making the right kinds of decisions? We don't know very much about our Constitution. I've heard lots of people say, well, it's in the Constitution, I can do this, I can't do that. And it isn't in the Constitution. It has nothing whatever to do with the Constitution. They don't understand what is, and many people don't. You know, the average reader of reasonable comprehension and speed can read the Constitution in a mere 43 minutes. 43 minutes. And understand it. Well, maybe not understand it, but they can read it. They can understand what's in it, even if they don't understand the terms and conditions. But they don't know. And they don't know very much about U.S. history. We just don't know much about our history. We think we do, but we don't know very much about our history. Ask yourself this, for example. Do you think that African Americans would be so loyal to the Democratic Party if they knew that the Democrats opposed the emancipation of the slaves during the time of Lincoln? Do you think that they would be so loyal to the Democratic Party if they knew that the Democratic Party instituted Jim Crow laws, created the Ku Klux Klan, fought for segregation, and even opposed the 1964 Civil Rights Act, which it took Republicans to pass, even though there was a Democratic senator? Do you know, feel as though if they knew those sorts of things, they might look at the Democratic Party a little bit differently than they do right now? I think they would. The reality is that we do not have an adequate working knowledge about how government functions because we've put civics on the shelf, so to speak, and we don't teach our young people that. Parents do, and to a certain extent, something that resembles, if you will, civics in some dimension gets taught in what's the general title, what social studies, but we really don't spend a lot of time teaching civics, and therefore we don't know about the functions of our government very much. And it doesn't make any difference how well educated you are. I know people who have PhDs in various types of disciplines who really don't know very much about how the U.S. government functions. And the problem isn't that they don't know. The problem is that we have unrealistic expectations about how our government will act, what it is capable of doing, what it is not capable of doing. And those unrealistic expectations cause us to think that certain things will happen or won't happen or couldn't happen, and they could, and they do, or they don't, and then we become upset, we become cynical about it. Now, many of us also, as we prepare for this election, or those folks who've already voted, vote the party of our parents. Think about that. Remember when you were kids? Did you ever have neighborhood arguments around this time of the year, this season, election season for president, about who their parents or your parents were backing and voting for? I remember we did. I remember growing up that was a pretty fierce debate going on. We didn't understand the issues that were at stake, but we definitely understood that we're on this side or we're on that side of a particular election. This candidate is the one we're behind. That one is the one we dislike. We don't really know why. And a lot of folks who vote even as adults don't really know why. You know, we vote the way we were brought up. By God, my dad was a Republican. I'll, by God, be a Republican too. That's not very deep. And many of us also vote a straight ticket. That has become known now as tribalism, right? We just simply vote the entire ballot for this party or for that party without any regard as to whether or not the individuals that we are saying we want to place in office are even qualified to be there. We do it on both sides of the aisle, by the way. The Republicans do it, the Democrats do it. All I need to know is whether there's an R after that guy's name or whether there's a D after her name, and they'll get my vote. And many of us are also one-issue oriented. There is a vast, complex spectrum of issues involved in this and every election. Certainly in this election, there are some very complex issues. But you know that some folks basically have what we call a litmus test. If this person is for that or not for that, they're not getting my vote. It's simple as that. Abortion, race relations, even COVID-19 and the handling of it, gay rights, union interests, and believe it or not, Donald Trump's tweets. That's what sells them or doesn't sell them. Simple as that. And that happens with great regularity. Now, those are attitudinal sorts of things. Those are things that people think in their hearts and minds. But there are outside influences that also affect us. And the two chief among them are the press and social media. And we're going to get to that in just a moment. Let me tell you how you can contact the program if you want to talk to us and how you can get engaged in the conversation today. Here is a email address for you, right? Vinny at SpokaneTalksMedia.com. If you want to get on the show with us, if you have a phone or a computer or a laptop or whatever the case happens to be, you can do that. If you email Vinny, who's our producer, he will give you a password which will allow you then to get on the program, and you can talk live with us today if you're interested in doing that. Okay? Right now we're going to take a timeout. When we come back, we're going to talk about the press and social media.
Hi, I'm Rob Chase, and I'm running for Washington State 4th Legislative District in Spokane County. We need to get back to first principles of respect for providence, tradition, property, and transparency. I'll work in Olympia to make America great again. I believe I can be a good representative for the 4th District because truth matters. Vote for me, Rob Chase.
Paid for by the Committee to Elect Rob Chase, Republican. Seattle Democrats are pushing for more taxes, even though they just raised taxes last year. They also want a state income tax and even a head tax on every employee a business hires. I will oppose new taxes that will hurt working families and small businesses who are already hurting from the COVID crisis. I'm Jenny Graham, and I'm your Mighty 6th District Rep.
Paid for by the committee to re-elect Jenny Graham, Republican.
Welcome back to For Critical Thinkers. We're talking about how we prepare to cast our ballot and what a responsible voter will do. I'm sorry to have to report to you, although I know it comes as no surprise, that a great many voters in this country, millions upon millions upon millions, are not terribly responsible about what they do with their vote for reasons I've discussed and for more that we'll take a look at. Let's look at the influences of the things that we have to deal with in order to come to a reasoned conclusion about how we're going to vote. The power of the press. The press, of course, is protected by the First Amendment to the Constitution of the United States. Congress shall make no law abridging the press, the freedom of the press. That doesn't necessarily mean that the people who call themselves journalists won't, in fact, take unfair, unreasonable, and even deplorable advantage of that freedom that we have bestowed upon them, because indeed they do that, as you know, and so do I. In fact, we have to ask the question, does the press have the ability to affect the outcome of elections? And the answer is yes, it has always had that. And at one point, we understood where the press was. Back, we spoke of Lincoln a little earlier, back 150 years ago, newspapers were the only mass media that existed. And newspapers would choose up sides. They would back this candidate or that candidate. They would back this ballot issue or that ballot issue. That was par for the course. Everybody knew it. But they also knew where these people stood, because the people expressly, the newspapers, as editors and publishers of newspapers, expressly stated what their politics was all about. Even had mastheads on newspapers that were the such and such Democrat or the such and such Republican or whatever the case may be. And these were known to be the political stance of a given publication, newspaper. And of course, endorsements by newspapers went along party lines, but we understood what the endorsement would likely be because we understood where the newspaper was. Long about the electronic age, the dawn of radio in the early 20th century and through television in the middle 20th century and up to today's age with respect to electronic media, the media has been dishonest with us insofar as they have still maintained their bias. In fact, they have increased their bias dramatically, especially this year, but they've always denied they had one. Except for this year, they're not even bothering to do that anymore. So yes, they can influence the outcome. We have to ask this question: where have all the journalists gone? Where are they? Where are the people we used to have a sense of honor for because they were looking out for our interests? They were digging up, if you will, the issues that were taking place and letting us know about them so that we would be in a position to do something about that, particularly at the ballot box. Where are they now? What has happened to objective, balanced reporting? It used to be that the average journalist, no matter how skillful they were as an investigator or as a writer, was dedicated unequivocally to making sure that they got the truth and that they were objective about the way they reported it, which means that they investigated all sides of an issue. They talked to all parties in interest, and they wrote or broadcast, if you will, a story that was fully dimensional, that we could see and study the entirety of it as opposed to just one side. What has happened to the pursuit of truth now? Look at our media. You've got newspapers, you've got television networks who are refusing to cover news that is of particular weight and particular importance to this election that, if known, would unequivocally change a great many millions of Americans' votes about things, and they will not cover the story. They will not even acknowledge that it exists. On the other hand, they have covered false stories for years to take down the political opposition they perceived. Even though millions and millions of taxpayer dollars were spent to find out whether or not there was any truth to it, it turned out there wasn't, and it turned out they knew fairly early on that it wasn't true. So whatever happened to the pursuit of truth? Whatever happened to journalistic integrity? You can't trust these people anymore. Donald Trump calls it the fake news, and that's true, but it's worse than that. It's not just fake. It's not just fake. It's a serious, serious danger to the future of our democratic republic. Do we look at it that way, or do we just do nothing about it? Bias is one thing, of course, and the press has been biased. We know that. But deliberate dishonesty and deliberate cover-up of stories that should be reported in their full detail goes way, way, way beyond bias. That requires a certain lack of integrity, a certain lack of ethics, even possible criminal activity on the part of the people that we trust as the watchdogs to bark when something's out of order. What has happened to the press? And what effect has that had on us as voters to not have access to information that is vitally important for us to make a reasoned and a critically defensible position? Polling manipulation, ignoring legitimate news, blatant advocacy has replaced objectivity, has replaced the pursuit of truth. You know, there's such an organization as the Society of Professional Journalists, and these are people who are supposed to guide journalists with respect to a canon of ethics that they follow. And there is a whole list of those ethics. These are not laws, but people who are members of the SPJ and who have put that logo, if you will, on their plaques and on their mastheads and on the wall and what have you in their offices, are professing to adhere to these journalistic ethical canons, and they don't. Indeed, they don't. Whatever happened to that volunteering to be as accurate and as just and as truthful as you can? Gone. Pew Research, which is a research think tank that I pay a lot of attention to. It's just a little center left, but I got to tell you, they do a good job. They really do. And notwithstanding the political leanings, if you will, which I don't think are particularly invasive in terms of how they do their job, they have put out an Excellence in Journalism report year to year to year for many, many, many years. And throughout my career, I paid attention to it. In the period of January the 4th through October the 20th, according to Pew, of this year, stories about President Trump reported by the so-called mainstream media. We're talking about ABC, NBC, CBS. We're talking about New York Times, MSNBC, CNN, and the Washington Post. This group, taken as a whole, has perhaps the largest overall audience in terms of news value that any organizations would otherwise have. So they call that the mainstream media. Mainstream, of course, is, I think, a misnomer. I don't know that they're even all that connected to how we really think outside the Beltway. But in any event, they reported stories about Donald Trump as president, 92% negative in that period of January to the middle of this current month. 92% negative. So only 8 out of 100 stories they wrote had any kind of a benevolent or if you will, objective point of view. Everything else was critical. Everything else was critical. Now, if a lot of folks are getting their news from those resources, and they believe these people are actually telling the truth because they're not critical thinkers and they don't delve into things and they don't find out that they're being fed a line of malarkey, they're going to act as though that is in their best interest. Their perception of their best interest is simply going to be Wrong. That doesn't stop them, and they've done that. Think about that. Even people you don't like very much at all are not 92% evil. They're just not. And folks who may have personalities we don't care for or whatever, that doesn't mean that they're not competent at the kind of work they do, maybe even skilled and admirably so. But if the press is going to report on politicians negatively 92% of the time, public perception of that politician, any of them, doesn't make any difference whether they're Democrat or Republican, going to be negative as well. Unless the recipients of that information, the consumers of that news and information, are themselves critical thinkers. Then you have social media, the power of social media. And boy, haven't we seen that just in the last few days. Did you pay any attention to the hearings that occurred in the Commerce Committee of the Senate just 2 days ago with respect to the big three platforms on social media? Google, Facebook, Twitter. The takeaway from that, the major takeaway from that is this question: who elected a handful of Silicon Valley billionaires to be the gatekeepers of free speech in America? Who gave them that authority? Who gave these people the right to censor free expression whenever it doesn't reflect their own particular political views or worldview? Why are we allowing this to happen? Why are you allowing it to happen? Why am I allowing it to happen? Perhaps our most sacred fundamental right, the right to freedom of expression, is being trampled on by these people. And the people we have elected, the government people we have elected, have known this for a long, long time and have done nothing about it. You individually, me individually, all of us collectively can, of course, address the issue to some extent at the ballot box this time, next Tuesday. But we can't unilaterally, even in great numbers, change this. I'm talking about Section 203 of the law that enables these people, these platforms, to be called platforms and not publishers. The FCC rules that give them the power to do this sort of a thing. And without any attempt to push back against them, they'll continue to do this and have been emboldened for quite some time and have actually increased this sort of thing. Where is our outrage with respect to this? Where is it? If we're going to be critical thinkers, we have to have, and know we have, unfettered, uninterrupted access to information. And that includes information shared by our peers, not just by the news and information industry, but by folks who tweet, folks who send articles and information to one another via Facebook, or folks who look up websites on Google and are being manipulated away from information that Google doesn't want them to be able to easily access or find, for the reason that the political information contained there is not to their liking. And we don't think about that when we Google things, because we Google things almost automatically. And we also don't think of the fact that Google is so large, so huge, controls such a percentage of the advertising value in terms of search engines, that there is nobody that can touch them. Well, there are other choices, but they don't have anywhere near the range that Google has, with the obvious and logical result that they have a monopoly, most powerful search engine on the planet. And they can manipulate the hearts and minds of people, public opinion, elections. You get it? A critical thinker understands this, knows this is not right, and understands his or her own personal responsibility to do something about it. Which brings us to the issues of this election. What are the key issues? in the election that will conclude on the 3rd of November, next Tuesday? We'll tackle that question when we come back.
We are living in historic times. Our courts will be dealing with new and unprecedented issues. I am Judge Tracy Staub, and I'm running for judge at the Court of Appeals. Our state will need a judge with experience and proven leadership to handle these issues. I am the only candidate with experience as a prosecutor, defense attorney, and trial judge. It has never been more important to vote for a judge with experience and a passion for law and justice. I am Judge Tracy Staub, and I'm asking for your vote this November.
Fact. All of the top most dangerous cities are led by Democrats. Confounding fact. All the cities that are trying to defund the police are led by Democrats. So let's get this straight. The Democratic answer to crime is less police? You have a right to be safe from criminals. Vote to protect your family. Vote the GOP. Vote Republican. Paid for by Spokane GOP.
Hi, I'm Dave Lucas. I'm running for state senator. In a matter of months, another legislative session will begin. In a matter of months, your taxes will increase again. Andy Billig is the driving force in the Senate behind this radical taxation. Let him know we are done with his style of leadership.
Paid for by Dave Lucas for state senator, Republican.
Welcome back to this edition of For Critical Thinkers, the election edition. Let's get back to critical thinking. Let's get back to acting in our own best interests. Some important questions. What are the most important issues voters are concerned about in this election? Now, you may be more concerned about a particular issue than someone else is, but there are a handful of these issues that are important to take a look at. The number one, what would you guess the number one thing is? The number one thing is the economy. Even in this age of coronavirus and all, the number one thing is the economy. In fact, 44% consider that to be extremely important, 45% very important. That's the number one thing, again, according to Pew Research, and backed up by a poll that just came out earlier this month, I should say, about mid-month, from Gallup. The second biggest important thing is, believe it or not, terrorism and national security. Terrorism and national security. You'd think, wait a minute, terrorism? Hadn't been a terrorist act. Yeah, well, there have been. And we're still very concerned. And part of that, a big part of that, is domestic terrorism. Organizations and groups that have been burning our cities and looting and raising holy hell in major blue state cities since early last summer. The third, obviously, is the coronavirus at 42% concern. Serious, early, the most extreme concern. And then 34% consider that to be very important. And that's followed by several other things: education, racism, immigration issues, crime, abortion. Climate change is way down there. Climate change is something that certain parties press for and push for and try to get it to rise up to the most important thing that people are thinking about, but it really isn't. Climate change is not that important. And of this list, the lowest it happens to be with relationships with foreign countries, foreign affairs, in other words. So therefore, these are the issues that are going to drive people's votes. And what do we know about these things? We have to ask the question, are you, if you consider yourself to be a critical thinker, are you or are the people who have cast those 80 million ballots thus far in the United States, either by mail-in or in person up to this day, are they truly informed about these key matters? Or are they just forming opinions without much depth of knowledge? Remember that opinions are like noses. Everybody's got one. You don't have to have much between your ears to have a nose, and you don't have to have much between your ears to have an opinion. And most of the people who are walking around bloviating about what they think about this or think about that don't have very much depth of knowledge at all, and it doesn't take long to call them out on it. But they vote, which by itself may be a fearful concept. How deeply have people examined these particular issues before they cast their ballot? How important is it to them to do that? Where did we get our information that helped us to form our opinion about something, the stand we take, and thus the decisions we will make about candidates and ballot issues pertaining to these particular issues? Where did it come from? Was the information well sourced? Was it accurate? We just talked about the press and social media, which, by the way, happen to be the two major sources people refer to when trying to educate themselves on issues. And the pitfalls associated with going there ought to be pretty obvious to you already. Was the information well sourced, and was it accurate? Very often people will source folks who are going to tell them, the reporters, what they want to know. They get these think tanks, they get these experts, and when you take a look at, okay, well, who's that individual that's supposedly being presented to me as an expert? What are they really an expert in? And, you know, if you were a serious critical thinker, you would look them up, the person who is being quoted as the authority on this matter, and you'd find out where they come from and what their perspective is. And sometimes you'd be astounded that these people are not experts at all. They're only presented because they know that the vast majority of audience that sees them exposed as an expert and speaking on the things that they're supposedly expert about are never going to vet them at all. They'll just accept what they say at face value. And also, did you look at all of the relevant points of view? Very often the press doesn't do that. I just mentioned that. But did you? Just because the press doesn't mean you don't have an obligation to verify what the press tells you now. It's sad that that has to be the case. It was a time when you really could trust to some extent what the media told you, but now you got to be really careful about what you trust, because these folks are constantly trying to pull the wool over your eyes. And they do so sometimes so skillfully that you can't tell when you're basically being ripped off informationally. What are the top 6 reasons why people don't like President Trump? What do you suppose they are? The top 6. There are dozens and dozens and dozens and dozens of reasons that are expressed all the time. Most of these are subjective opinions about, but here are the ones that the polling indicates are the top reasons. Number 1, they don't like him because he will tweet whatever comes into his head. These are words from the leader of the free world, and they have consequences. I don't like that part about Trump either. That's one of my complaints about the president. Because he has no personal integrity. He lies incessantly and has no regard for facts or history. I haven't seen, I've heard this complaint a lot, but I haven't seen anybody back it up with anything other than an opinion. Not a lot of depth of fact. And so when people say those sorts of things, if that seems to be one of the top reasons why people don't like Trump, they're not digging very deep to determine exactly what it is about him that is so objectionable in my view. Third, they say because he is a bully and has no respect for people. Have you studied the history of Donald Trump? Have you studied him? Have you seriously looked into what this person has been about for the last 3 or 4 decades? You'd find some things that would absolutely blow you away with respect to caring for people and respecting people. You really would. Now, I'm not trying to sell you on Trump. You vote whatever way you want to. But if you're going to vote as a critical thinker, you're going to know the truth about these things to support your bias with respect to it. And that's fine by me if you do. If it's not, it's just like a nose. Everybody's got one. And because he has furthered the air of incivility and divisiveness in the country. You've heard that a lot. The media loves to tell you that. If you watch MSNBC or if you watch CNN, they will pound away at that particular theory night after night after night. They never tell you what he has done that's so uncivil. just things he has said they don't like. Because he doesn't listen to points of view that are different from his own. This one puzzles me. This is number 5 out of the top 6. This one puzzles me. Everyone who has ever worked for Donald Trump will tell you he listens intently. Does he agree with what they want to do? Not always. Often, but not always. But they will tell you he listens, and he asks intelligent questions, and he probes all elements of things, which a president ought to do. Again, I'm not trying to sell you on Trump. I'm just trying to show you that there is a truth you don't know about if you didn't know that. And because he's pushed through an unneeded tax cut that mostly benefited his rich buddies and corporations and has added another $1 trillion to our deficit. The president requires an act of Congress in order to spend any money. So the president by himself didn't do these things. In concert with the House of Representatives, which has been Democrat for the last couple of years, and the Senate, which has been Republican for the last couple of years, certain emergency expenditures have been made. Now, whether you like those or don't like those, you have to understand that the recovery economically of this country that was virtually getting close to 40% unemployment due to COVID-19 required desperate measures. And the fact that it raised the debt by $1 trillion bothers a lot of folks who are fiscal conservatives, and I'm one of those, right? But I mean, you got to get your water bill up if you're going to pour a lot of water on a house on fire. And if you consider that, oh my goodness, I'll be consuming too much water, and you allow the fire to burn the house down, that's a foolish decision. That's stupid. And notice, by the way, that these objections to the president are mostly opinions about his personality. They don't actually reflect his record very much as chief executive and also as commander-in-chief. They don't. These objections are largely uninformed and knee-jerk. That doesn't mean people aren't going to vote based on those. They do, and they will, and they have, and they will continue to. What are the top 6 reasons why people don't like Joe Biden? Chief among the reasons why people don't like Joe Biden, because he is not mentally competent to serve as president of the United States, and therefore voters fear he will be manipulated in office by the far left wing of the Democratic Party. In fact, there are voters who believe that he won't even serve out a term in office before he is replaced under the 25th Amendment and Kamala Harris becomes the president of the United States if he's elected on Tuesday. That's a pretty serious concern, and I wonder why Democrats of good standing, Democrats who are true to the Democratic point of view, are willing to accept an individual to be their president who they know is not competent enough to likely finish a term. You remember back, I spoke to you about this once before, back in the 80s when Thomas Eagleton, a senator from the Midwest, was diagnosed as having had some heart problems and some issues with respect to his mental stability, depression, things of that nature. He was the vice presidential candidate on the Democratic ticket, and 2 weeks after he was chosen for that, he was removed from the ticket because he, a heartbeat away from the presidency, was unlikely to be able to handle the presidency should he ever have to step in because something would have happened to the top of the ticket. And now we have the top of the ticket in that condition of doubt, and we have seen countless, those of us who have been watching carefully have seen. The press has hidden countless, dozens, hundreds, or dismissed as gaffes mental incompetencies displayed by Joe Biden on the campaign trail. Why do you suppose that he is the very first presidential candidate in my lifetime and in yours, I dare say, who has seldom gone out on the campaign trail, spent days on end, weeks on end, in total time available to campaign, holed up in his basement and reading a teleprompter to deliver information, and not even doing that competently? There's something there. The press doesn't want to admit it because it would create a doubt. And that doubt might result in his not being popular enough to be president of the United States, because the low information voter, the non-critical thinker, who is going to vote because daddy was a Democrat, and I'm a Democrat too, by God, and I vote for anybody who's got a D after their name, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, going to do that. I'm charging you to be more of a critical thinker, and if you in fact cast a ballot for Biden, it's because you know that he is competent rather than incompetent, or you at least have satisfied yourself that there isn't a problem there. But you've satisfied yourself with the facts, not a knee-jerk reaction and an opinion. Another reason, because he lies a lot. He has falsely claimed to hold 3 bachelor's degrees and to have graduated at the top of his law school class, of which he wasn't. He got a full scholarship, which he didn't get. That he falsely claimed to have come from a family of coal miners in northeastern Pennsylvania, which isn't true. That he plagiarized in law school, and when he wrote his speeches, he said that he was arrested with Nelson Mandela, which is not true. It didn't happen. During his recent debate against Bernie Sanders during the primary, he looked Sanders in the eye and the American people in the eye right into the camera and falsely claimed not to have repeatedly supported the Hyde Amendment, which, as you probably know, bans federal funding of abortion, but he did support it. He said he was going to stop fracking, now claims he never said that, but there's all kinds of videotape. You can go on and on and on and on and on. So, like Trump, and people who think Trump is a liar and gets things, there's lots and lots and lots and lots of evidence that Biden isn't the truth teller either, if at all. Another complaint, because he has a long history of racist comments and policies. I marveled when I heard Vice President Biden say in an interview that if you don't know whether you're going to vote for Trump or for Biden, you ain't black. In other words, I'm the Democratic candidate and I own you. How dare you say that you have questions as to whether or not you'll vote for me? If I were a person of color, that'd have been all I need to hear from a candidate who claims to have my best interests in mind and basically is telling me, just like the old slave master used to tell people back in the middle of the 19th century, I own you. You don't leave here without my permission. Amazing. And yet there's so many black Americans who will vote for him just because he's a Democrat. Those racial policies that he is criticized for include the 1994 Violent Crime Control and Law Enforcement Act, which put an awful lot of black people in prison for nonviolent crimes. Now, just this year, black Americans have begun to wonder about that. Do you remember 4 years ago when Donald Trump said, what do you got to lose? Voting for a Republican, what do you got to lose? And this year, it appears as though Trump is going to draw upwards of twice the number of blacks voting for him that he did in 2016, and maybe even enough to threaten that threshold with respect to African American vote that, if crossed, would make it impossible for Democrats to win a national election. It's possible. Will it happen? I don't know. But there definitely are a number of folks breaking away from blind allegiance to the Democratic Party who are people of color. Lastly, Biden is spoken of as having a creepy penchant for sniffing, kissing, and fondling women and children against their will. Have you ever seen an example of that? Something that he's been doing, it appears, for years and years and years. And just recently, one last one, which is beginning to start to surface, but has been suppressed by the media, social media, and by the mainstream press. Because his family has engaged for many years, it appears, in foreign influence peddling, selling access to Joe Biden as a powerful American politician. Now then the question is, are these positions, these objections, well thought through? Is there evidence to support them? Has a reasonable investigation been undertaken by voters who will not vote for Joe Biden? Or is this just more knee-jerk stuff? It isn't just the right, it isn't just the left. The obligation to know why you're casting the ballot that you're casting is universal. It knows no political allegiance. We have an obligation to do that. And for those of us who haven't cast our ballots weeks and weeks and weeks ahead of things as they've unfolded in the current news cycles, we have more information to look at and analyze and evaluate before we vote than those 80 million people who have already cast their ballots. Now, I understand that because of COVID, because of their concern about getting sick, and because of the availability of mail-in balloting, that was a option that was certainly perhaps considered to be more safe than going to the polls in the traditional way. And I don't have any argument with that. But voting as early as September for a November election, where the last 2 months of the campaign very often are filled with new disclosures, new discoveries, new information about the candidates, places them at a disadvantage. And I suggest to you that those who took advantage of that and voted early didn't look very deeply at the choices they were making. I'd have fit some of those categories I was talking about. So therefore, you have the responsibility, since forecasts show that about 150 million ballots are going to be cast in the election by next Tuesday night, both mail-in as well as in person. And about 80 million have come through already. So approximately 50% thereabouts have been cast. And since that's the situation, the other half has the opportunity. You, if you haven't voted yet or filled out a ballot, you have the opportunity to be a critical thinker in how you make your choices. Not only the opportunity, but the obligation to be more, shall I say, thorough about the choices you make and the validity of your ballot, the research that you put into it, and such. There's an opportunity for you to do that. Whoever you choose, make sure that it's an intellectually defensible selection. That's the important part. Make sure that you have satisfied the criteria of a critical thinker. A lot of folks won't. Being a critical thinker requires an investment of time and an investment of effort that usually is significantly beyond that which most people are willing to invest. Just is. But if we don't do that, we become complacent with information that we accept at face value. We form opinions with much, much less fuel in them than opinions should have for matters as critical as these. And we set ourselves up for consequences that we will deeply, deeply regret. I hope that we haven't done that. I hope that we haven't done that as a country and that we will not do that as a country. There are reasons to like and dislike. There are reasons to support and to withdraw support from the candidates who are seeking our vote as President of the United States. But let's remember, we're hiring a chief executive, not a pastor. We are hiring an individual to guide our country for the next 4 years, not for the next 3 months. We are hiring an individual to help solve some deep, deep problems we have as a nation, not the least of which is coronavirus, but certainly not the only thing. Building unity and cooperation and mutual respect back into our society is another area. We need to do that as well. Leading us to legislation that will solve problems, that will advance our token as a country, that will improve our lot for the citizens of the United States, and continuing to advance our respectability and our interests on an international basis are part of the deal. Those are complicated territories. Those require a great deal of thought. And for voters, it requires more than just well, my daddy was a Democrat or my daddy was a Republican and I'm going to vote Republican too. Tribalism is not critical thinking. And rejecting information about the candidate we like because I don't want to hear about that. I don't want to hear about that. Even if you did hear about that and knew that, you know what, this kind of changes everything. If you don't want to hear the good with the bad or the bad with the good, so to speak, then obviously you don't want to be a critical thinker about this. You just want to knee-jerk, and once that's done, you want to dismiss yourself from any further responsibility. We have a solemn obligation, therefore, in the days ahead. A solemn duty. And I hope we perform it well. I hope we perform it after an exercise in significant critical thinking. I'm Mike Fitzsimmons, and that's this edition for Critical Thinkers, and I'll see you next time.